Today we'll be sewing our Gus Steel cargo pocket pattern. This pattern is included as part of our travel pants and is also featured as the pockets of both our free Advent Calendar Sew Guide as well as our Pocket Organizer Sew Guide. It's available to purchase by itself so that you can add a cargo pocket or two to anything you want. To sew one cargo pocket with a button flap, you will need 2 flap pieces, a small scrap of fusible interfacing, and a button. To sew the pocket itself, you will need 1 pocket front and a gusset. You will also need a bit of binding to finish the top edge and a bit more binding if you'll be creating the Hong Kong seams as we are in this sew-along. We'll start with creating the pocket flap. This is completely optional as you are sure to find many uses for the pocket without the flap as well. First, we need to reinforce where we'll be sewing the buttonhole. Press your scrap of fusible interfacing to the wrong side of one of your flap pieces. You can estimate where it should be, or you can take the time to mark it if you prefer. Now match the 2 flap pieces with right sides together and clip around the bottom edge, leaving the top open. Take this to your sewing machine and sew around the clipped edges, being sure to pause and raise your presser foot to make neat turns at each corner. Go ahead and turn your flap right side out, and then press the flap neatly, making sure the corners are crisp. Now we'll top stitch with a small seam allowance around the edge we just sewed together. I'm using a buttonhole foot. Your machine may work differently, but you want to sew a buttonhole the right size for your chosen button onto the pocket flap. I just folded my pocket flap in half to find the center, but you may have already marked the proper place for your buttonhole before starting. To make sure I don't open the buttonhole too far, I place a pin at the top of the buttonhole, then use my seam ripper to cut the buttonhole and then tidy it up with some scissors. Now, just to make sure, I check that the button fits properly. Okay, now we'll start on the pocket. For this, you'll need a pocket front and a gusset. Place the gusset around the outer edge of the 2 sides and the bottom of the pocket front. The pocket and the gusset should be right sides together, and you need to be careful when you get to the corners. Sew around the gusset, flattening out the fabric as you approach each corner to be sure it doesn't end up puckering. Check your work to be sure your corners look the way you'd like. Now, clip the gusset at each corner to help the fabric lie flat. If you are not sewing Hong Kong seams, you can instead use pinking shears to finish the raw edges of the seam allowance, or you can serge or sew an overcast stitch around the 3 edges you've already sewn. If you are sewing Hong Kong seams, you'll lay the right side of your flat binding to the wrong side of the pocket. You can see the gusset is on the other side. Lay the binding down just like you did with a gusset, pinning as you go and being careful around the corners. Now sew around the 3 edges again right on top of the seam you already made. To bind the edges, you'll fold the binding right over the seam allowance and press it. Work your way around the pocket, bringing the binding over the seam allowance, pressing and clipping as you go. You'll sew around the binding from the wrong side of the pocket with a stitch in the ditch. Let me show you what that means. I prefer to use my zipper foot, but you don't have to. Stitch in the ditch simply means that you will hide your new stitches by sewing them in the ditch created by the seam that's already there. See how my needle falls directly between the pink and yellow fabric? That's the ditch. Okay, clean up the pocket by trimming off any excess binding and turn your pocket right side out. Now we'll bind the pocket top with double fold binding. Place a length of binding at the top of the pocket with right sides together and the gusset spread out on both sides. Clip the binding to the pocket. Make sure that your seams are pushed towards the outside of the pocket so the finished pocket will lay nicely. Sew across the top of the pocket. Fold the binding up and give it a press, then turn the pocket over and fold the binding down twice. The first time, the edge of the binding will meet the edge of the seam, and then you'll fold it down again over the edge of the seam. Fold and clip as you go until you've enclosed the top of the pocket in the binding. Now you'll sew across the top of the pocket. This time you'll sew on the binding, not in the ditch as you did with the Hong Kong seams. Trim the excess binding again. Now you can get your pocket and flap ready to attach to your project. Starting with the flap, if you've made one, you'll fold the top edge down a ½ inch towards the wrong side and press it. Then, fold it down an additional ½ inch and press it again. Now we'll do similarly for the pocket, except that this time we'll be folding a ¼ inch and another ¼ inch. Clip it as you go to keep it nice and neat. Your pocket and flaps are done now and you can attach them to anything you choose, but I wanted to show you how I sew them on. I like to use my projector or the paper pattern piece and some tailor's chalk to draw the front pocket piece in place. Your finished pocket will be a 1/4 inch smaller than the 3 attached sides of the pattern piece, so either cut the paper pattern down or trace a 1/4 inch smaller than the projected pattern. Then I just pin the edges of the pocket on the line I traced, removing the clips as I go. Take extra care around the corners not to pucker the fabric. If you are sewing with an especially heavy fabric, as we call for in our advent calendar and pocket organizer, and you're not concerned about tiny objects falling through, you can sew the pockets on in 3 separate lines of stitching, leaving the point of the corner unsewn. If you're sewing a garment, I'd recommend carefully sewing the corners if you can. Once your pocket is on, if you sewed one, you can attach the pocket flap now. Place it just above the top of the pocket and pin it in place. Sew across the first fold. Then fold the flap down and sew a long rectangle across the top of the flap. Now you'll sew on your button. And you're all done.